All right, well, thank you. Thank you. This room is unusual for those of us who like to do participatory work. So let me begin by thanking Mark, who has been amazing in welcoming me, us, making it easy to get here. I ended up changing my airline reservations a bunch of times, and you were just amazing. So I so appreciate the humanity, the politics, the intellect, and the generosity of how you've brought us all here. And I know many of my colleagues appreciate you. And yesterday was just a blessing to be welcomed by life speaker Star Blanket, and then to allow Yvonne, Marie, Bud, Lee, and Linda kind of design an intellectual and ethical and cultural platform upon which I can now dance. So thank you all for doing the hard work yesterday. I appreciate your speaking from the position of administrators, so I now don't have to take that position. And I want to talk about the politics and promiscuity of evidence. And I want to raise the cynical question of, is this really about accountability? Is this really about evidence? Did it start out being about accountability and end up being about dismantling of all things public? And so I will speak from my space, which is the United States. And what I want to do is, it's humbling to be on land that is recognized as having been taken by others, as I'm about to tell you stories of New York City, where local schools are being closed and taken by corporate elites from Black and brown communities, flipped into charter schools, and then ultimately flipped into condominiums. And the terrible circuits of dispossession persist even though our biographies and histories are quite distinct. So I want to offer you tapas. You know tapas? Do we have tapas in Regina? Like little Spanish dishes of ideas. Is that okay? And then we can play for the rest of our lives together. So, so I've rewritten this talk 1,000 times, including last night. And what I thought might be helpful are kind of three ways of thinking about evidence, because the truth is I'm actually pretty nerdy, and I am a social psychologist, and I'm actually interested in evidence. I'm interested in a wide spectrum of kinds of evidence, but I'm not one that thinks we shouldn't be tampering with questions of evidence or accountability. And yet I worry. So here are the three tapas, and I'm going to start from the most hopeful and then back into the least hopeful, which is not my strategy. Usually I start a little critical and then end up, here's the possibilities. But I want to start with possibilities so that you're all in the room, and then I'm going to end with some hard issues, including the issues that we've confronted as activists. So here are the three tapas. One is, it seems pretty clear that evidence-based practice and evidence in the United States, elsewhere, is being used for what I have called punitive accountability. It's a kind of gotcha system. It's designed to shame, humiliate teachers, K through 12, and now higher ed, to undo all things public. All right, so that's stronger than I believe, but not much. That's one plate. The second that I really won't get to deliver, but I want to say aloud, particularly in the midst of your recent TRC report, and having just come from South Africa, is I worry a lot about evidence displayed and ignored. I worry about the aftershocks in South Africa 20 years later, after the TRC, when so much of that evidence was not attended to. And I realize you're in a much fresher moment with your TRC report. I live in a country where we now have a pornography of watching Black men get shot by cops. You can watch it every night on the news. And we're fighting for cops to have cameras so that there's evidence. And there's evidence. And almost nobody's being held accountable. So my second and saddest tapas is when evidence is available and ignored. And my third, where I will begin, is begins where Bud and Linda ended, which is what does it mean to engage participatory research with communities, with social movements, to gather evidence that is meaningful to the local, to the political, to the ethical, to the cultural in participatory action research. All right, so can you imagine those three different tapas, all of which are called evidence? So I want us to trouble the notion that evidence is just test scores, or as David just did, that we have an obligation, I think, to open up this construct as though it's an assemblage, as though it's what Gloria Anzaldúa would think of as a stream with many currents and contradictory currents. So, okay. And I would say that as critical scholars, we have an obligation to think hard whose evidence matters, how we attend to evidence of historic oppression, colonial takeovers, and contemporary dispossession, and what's our role in particularly public universities, which is a meaningful distinction in the States, maybe less so here, in public universities to speak the unspeakable about whose evidence counts and what we do once the evidence is apparent. All right, can you hang with me around those things? Okay, so my most obnoxious tweetable is the neoliberal dismantling of all things public is currently in drag as accountability. If you want to tweet it, that's the kind of thing I put on my email, that's why I get in trouble. So I'm going to start with what I do mostly. 90% of my talks, 90% of my work comes out of the Public Science Project. Public Science Project is a collective of researchers, activists, community people, formerly incarcerated folks, school pushouts, etc. At the Graduate Center and through the Graduate Center, we come together to engage participatory action research. We do critical theory, we engage with local practices, and at this point, we're mostly working with social movements that are interested in a broader conception of evidence if they are fighting aggressive policing in the South Bronx. So we do community-based surveys generated by communities with research teams of 3 young people, 3 grandmothers who have been taking pictures of their grandsons being beat up by cops for too long, 2 lawyers, 2 researchers. Together we're the team, we create the surveys, they distribute the surveys. We present the surveys. If you go online to Public Science Project, there's one night 2 years ago in the Bronx where we got a van called the Illuminator. It's got like a bat signal that like can project. And we took our data from 1,200 surveys in the community, as well as secondary analyses of the police data from the community, and we did a public letter to the New York Police Department. Dear NYPD, we are the Morris Justice Project. And it was about 7 o'clock, and we had Dominican drummers, and then the sun went down, and all of a sudden, and we only had 3 minutes because we knew the cops were coming. But this was the community's desire to get the data back in the community. And then we produced T-shirts with some of the more compelling quotes from the open-ended data, like, why do I always fit the description? And it's very sobering. In my office, I have a child size of that T-shirt. And what we found there was, you know, of 3,798 stops that year in the South Bronx, 60% of older folks, over 40, had been told to move or keep moving when they're just standing in front of their building. 72% of young people were called racial slurs that I won't detail for you, or sexual slurs that I won't detail for you. Very high rates of stop and frisk, throwing kids to the ground, and 92% of the stops were innocent, did not result in either drugs or a weapon. And on the Illuminator, one of the bat signals said, you stopped us 3,789 times and you only found 8 guns. And last week, the local church did a gun buyback and they turned up 75 guns in an hour, and nobody called us the N-word or the F-word. So that's the kind of work we do. We do it, and we've got a group working in Brazil, a group working in South Africa of colleagues. So, and during the summer, we have incredible critical power institutes where teams of activists and researchers come together to the Graduate Center. We spend a week. Lee, Eve have participated in this. We've done work with Linda's folks in New Zealand. That's mostly the work we do. And what we're interested in is generating evidence of meaning on the ground to inform policy and social movements around education, criminal justice, and human rights. Is that okay? So that's good. That's as good as it's going to get, guys. It's going to get depressing from here forward. I want to actually say, before I get into the really creepy stories, rivaling Giovanna's capacity to remind us of what's happening in the States, I want to say that those of us who care about evidence in a deep and critical way, I know these are really hard times, but I actually think it's winnable. I think we're actually very good at getting hearts and minds. Whoever they are, and your they is my they, it's the same 5 white guys or whatever. They've got very deep pockets, very deep pockets. They own the media for the most part, the mainstream media. But I have to say, for being involved in so many of these movements, hearts and minds are available. Mostly people want to do good things. They want to live in more just cities. I know cities better than prairies. They want to go to schools that are organized around creativity and imagination, not test scores. They want to live in neighborhoods that are safe, but not abusive by the police. They don't want no cops. They just want to be policed in dignity, right? So I actually, if there's a takeaway, it's that those of us who are actually committed to evidence, we're going to win. I don't know if I'll still be alive, but we're going to win. And because I think the folks who are interested in short term, they actually have no sustainability plan, and they're not very good at what they do. So here's all the evidence of how they're not good at what they do. My first example, evidence as punishment. When science parades to justify the closing and the colonizing of public schools. I wrote the book Framing Dropouts in 1991. It was a critical ethnographic tale of a school building serving Black and Latino young people, most pushed out and disposable well before graduation. In 2009, almost 20 years later, I learned that Brandeis High School, I had never used the name before, was going to be closed. All of a sudden, the powers that be decided it was a failing school. No coincidence, the gentrifying Upper West Side, where Brandeis High School was located, was suddenly filled with young, white, and wealthy families, and they wanted their own high school. When I heard they were closing the building because of evidence-based failure, I was outraged, right? For years, parents, teachers, community, we had been saying this is a failing school. It's miseducating. Invest in the school. They didn't invest in the school. They created alternatives that creamed out very motivated young people, and they created a deeply disinvested school. And when the neighborhood turned white enough, they decided to close it and reopen it for the new families. When I heard that they were closing it, I went back and I looked at the book, and I read the preface. It was 1988 when I sat in the back of what I then called Comprehensive High School Auditorium, and I cried. Salty tears of joy and rage. 250 young people walked across the stage with flowers and corsages, cheers, and the rapid lights of cameras flickering for the survivors. This was a school of 3,000. 250 were crossing the graduation line. Mothers, aunts, fathers, siblings, grandparents gathered from the Bronx and Harlem, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic to celebrate their babies graduating high school. My field notes read, I just want a moment of silence for the 500 missing bodies. In a school of 3,000, barely 1 out of 12 graduated. Where were the disappeared? I wrote then, if this were a school with middle-class white students, everybody would be outraged. It would have been closed. What we tolerate for the poor is unthinkable for elites. At Brandeis in the 1980s, and certainly since, I learned that it was normative for Black and brown bodies to drain out of public institutions without diplomas. Few were alarmed by the disposability of a substantial majority of students of color. Progressives and conservatives explained the leakage differently. Progressives talked about structural racism and capitalism. Conservatives blamed the kids or their moms, or inadequate intelligence. but they both agreed that it was inevitable that only a small group would graduate. Little did I know, footnote, Yvonne, limits of ethnography. Little did I know in the late 1980s that mass incarceration was being drip-fed into the darkest neighborhoods of New York State. State coffers were quietly realigning budgets, migrating monies and bodies of color from schools to prisons. In 1973, the New York State prison population was 10,000. By 1980, it was 20,000. By 1992, it was 62,000. So as I sat that day in that gymnasium, I didn't realize that the state had other bids on these bodies. Only later would I learn that since 1989, there had been more blacks entering the prison system for drug offenses each year than there were graduating from the State University of New York with undergraduate masters and doctoral degrees combined. Almost 25 years later, after generations of disinvestment and disproportionate placement of difficult-to-teach, overage, undercredited students into the building, in the midst of a swelling inequality gap. Manhattan has the largest inequality of all the boroughs. New York City is one of the highest in the country and in the state, and New York State one of the highest in the country, and the United States is one of the highest inequality gaps in the world. At that moment, when income and real estate and human security were being declared the major issues, at that moment, the New York Times declared a crisis was finally being declared at Brandeis High School. And the solution, to close the school for the black and brown families that had attended it and reopen it for the local white families. Based on evidence. Evidence of test scores, graduation rates, and cumulative disregard, it was decided that in 2009, Brandeis, like many comprehensive high schools in New York, in Chicago, in Newark, in Detroit, in New Orleans, would be closed and either reopened for a selective school, which I'll get into a moment, or a charter school, which I'm happy to describe later, but with selective criteria, okay? And ironically, it was being the new school would be called Frank McCourt. People know Frank McCourt? Anyway, I'll tell you later. Anyway, the idea that like Louis Brandeis and Frank McCourt, two of the coolest white guys, right, who understood class politics, were being kind of traded for this race-class deception. So what I wrote is Frank and Louis would shit if they knew was being done in their names. That's why I get foiled. Community activists and educators were deeply engaged in challenging Brandeis's makeover. Most of the community meetings were cordial and seasoned with discussions about diversity, meaning bringing white people back into the building, which is what diversity means at that transitional moment. But then there was a slippery discourse of white deservingness leaking through the doors. I guess this school, one parent said, I guess this school will be for 3s and 4s, referencing high stakes test score signifiers that are burned into the souls of children in New York City. Children say, I'm a 2, I'm a 3, I'm a 1. 3s and 4s are gooder. Another parent said, you know, if we're serious about getting these kinds of students back into Brandeis, we're going to have to remove the metal detectors and the police. New York City has 5,000 NYPD in the high schools. They work for the NYPD, not for the education. And a woman facilitating the discussion said, you know what, if the other schools want to keep the metal detectors, maybe our students, the Frank McCourt students, should use the back door. And soon the discursive architecture of separate and unequal, what I used to call the discursive architecture of apartheid, and then my South African friend said, please don't use apartheid as the metaphor, call it Upper West Side. We've cleaned up our act a bit, right? So the discursive architecture of separate unequal was flooding the room, being spoken by white and African American and Latino prospective parents. A number of community members said, wait, this school has already betrayed Central and East Harlem for 30 years, and now you're going to clean it up and open it for a new group of young people, and the community will lose access to the last public institution It has, except for cops and military recruiters. Somebody said, how about a preference at least for the siblings of the children who went to the building? And the administrator said, no, 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 the building will be open to children citywide based on choice and using criteria that are demographically neutral. I'm so glad you're just laughing. I don't have to explain what's wrong with that. Students who satisfied the published criteria, a 3 or a 4 on standardized tests, submitting a written sample in English, good attendance, grade point average of a 3.0 in middle school, are eligible if their parents know to submit their names into a lottery. And then the lottery is actually fair. Right? So once you've gentrified the process to the very end, you get justice, right? So they're not going to just pick out the white people. All right, I won't tell you what's wrong with all this. You seem to get it. The community no longer owns that school. That school was basketball. It was English language classes. It was sewing and embroidery and parenting classes and programs run by and for the community. The building belongs to these separate charters. It's no longer part. And evidence, social science evidence, was the midwife of what originally, by the way, Rosa Luxemburg and then David Harvey would call accumulation of capital or accumulation by dispossession. In November of 1910, W.E.B. Du Bois published the first issue of Crisis magazine, a record of the darker races. He insisted that a record be kept on the ongoing crisis of the darker races, and that crisis, he said, for poor people and people of color was woven deeply into our nation's history as colonial takeover of land is woven into both of our nation's history. And he understood that public schools served as an institution through which crisis festered and was washed over to only reproduce race and class stratifications. And one of the things that Du Bois said is the ongoing moans of the darker race would only be attended to when there was a profit to be made. He and Naomi Klein, if they had a baby, it would be the current political moment in New York City. The consolidation of white supremacy and economic privilege masquerade as innocence, doing good for the community, saving bad schools, civil rights, educational progress, as long as we don't pay attention to those bodies that have been tossed out the window. That was scene 1. Scene 2, maybe called The Empire Strikes Back, or the voracious, aggressive appetite of elites to get their way. And the only thing I would disagree with yesterday is when, I think, Giovanna, you might have said that, elites promote an idea of individualism or practice an idea of individualism. They do as long as you say yes to them. When you say no to corporate elites, they become a gang. There's a mob mentality. There's a very collective spirit to the wealthy, the white, the elite, sustaining their privilege. And so even if free market is an illusion and austerity might be an illusion, the notion that elites work as individuals is really an illusion. So let me go into my next story. Mid-November, I left the YMCA in Montclair after swimming, which I really love to do, and I saw an email from a lawyer at CUNY, where I teach. Can we talk? We received a Freedom of Information request for your emails. See attached. My stomach dropped as I scrolled down. In some ways, I had been waiting for this. The last year and a half, I had been deeply embroiled in a parent, union, educator, civil rights, social movement in Montclair, New Jersey, where I live. It's a town where all the schools are by law, racially integrated, very well known for progressive educational politics. 18 months ago, a kind of corporate group took over the school board and they brought in a corporate reform superintendent from the Broad Academy. I don't know if that's a meaningful category here, just think, whatever, I'll detail. Very interested in dismantling public education, closing down big schools, anti-union, heavy testing for teacher evaluation, closing schools, reopening them as charters. That's the agenda. It's mostly been a black urban agenda. So we were the first kind of suburb. So it took a different form. It was a little more cleaned up. But some of us smelled it early. Smelling is a really important researcher task. So for 2 years, parents linking arms with educators and the union, we had been asking questions, hard questions, questions about evidence, which I actually think really pissed them off, right? Like we were questioning, where are you getting your data from? And why are you saying there's a gap? And then why are you saying you've narrowed the gap, right? We're a #1 community for racially integrated families, and we delight in the number of queer families in town. All right, so these corporate reformers were doing what they do in the States, maybe they do here. They were dangling the tragedy of the illiterate black and brown child as the reason that they had to evaluate teachers, fire teachers, close schools. So it's a kind of syrupy tragedy of the achievement gap. I don't know if you've got that yet. You'll get it. We transport all of our, you should build a wall. You really should build a wall, sorry. I know they want to do it with Mexico. You should do it. So while they were dangling the tragedy of the illiterate African-American child, which is the poster face in our town, they were also cutting supports for the most struggling students. They were doing away with paraprofessionals. They were cutting teachers. They were adding much more testing so that people couldn't do very much creative teaching. They were cutting after-school programs, after-school buses, all in the name of we have to help these poor children. And so we should test them more, like all the time, like constantly, and move a lot of computers into the building and then test the teachers on whether or not there's value added. Sorry, it's a promiscuous term. Value added, you know, if you start out at 4, you end up at 3. So a lot of us started asking questions. And I have to say that there was a strong, strong chill through the schools. The experience of surveillance, punishment, shaming, and potential negative consequences for teachers was fast. And this is in a town that had been lots of the schools, they're all magnets, they were teacher generated. There's, you know, it's an unfinished project. There's lots wrong with the schools, but there were places where teachers were supported, educated, etc., educating each other, developing professional development. In October, after the superintendent had been there about 2 years, all of a sudden they announced the miracle of the closing gap. Again, I don't know, we do this in the United States. We had one in Texas. You'll remember George Bush's lie. And anyway, we have these miracles that then are not such miracles. And so I had been pretty active at school board meetings, but I have to say it's like weird. It's your own town, your kids are in the school. So I'm much mouthier in New York than I had been in New Jersey. But all these teachers and paraprofessionals and parents started writing me, emailing me, in fact, about what was going on in their schools, and that I felt like I was in the position to ask hard questions at the school board meeting. So in October, when they declared the miracle of the closing gaps, I looked at the data and I said, you know, I think something's wrong with these data. Like the black-white gaps have narrowed, but white people are either middle class or very rich in our town, and African Americans range from extremely poor to extremely rich. So there's a crowd of very low income African Americans. So the gaps were in some ways predictable, but they had shockingly narrowed. And I said, I think just, you know, I'm not saying you're cherry picking, I always do that. You know, I'm not saying you're lying. It just seems like something's funny. Maybe you didn't include like the special ed kids, which is what they hadn't done. They'd removed the special ed kids from, which is a trick they do. 2 days later, I got the FOIL at CUNY. And the FOIL read, anonymous would like access to all of my emails between myself and 38 named people. They were the black mayor, the progressive black town councilman, the progressive black guy on the Board of Ed, the unbelievable friend of mine, black president of the teachers union, then a bunch of racially diverse parents, teachers, civil rights leaders, and journalists. It was straight out of McCarthy. You know, go for the educators, go for the journalists, go for the trade unionists, and go for the civil rights folks. 15 minutes, that's ridiculous. Okay, so it was really bad. It was really creepy. You know, I know I'm on TV. So when I first got this, I thought, well, CUNY is not going to cave. So CUNY took the position that because there was a freedom of information request, and we are a public institution, that they actually had to do this search and hand over what ended up being 1,000 of my emails to an anonymous other. Long story, we can talk about that another time. I have since discovered that this strategy of foiling public intellectuals at public universities who are taking up challenging corporate climate control, lead paint, immigration, election refiguring voting rights, and corporate education. This is happening all over the United States. We're all being foiled. And universities are responding differently, I have to say. Some say this is not institutional matter, which is what Biddy Martin did at Wisconsin. We'll send you the stuff that's relevant. Others, like CUNY, said anything on our server gets to go. We can talk about that. What do I want to say? Well, I think what I want to say about this story, because I only have 15 minutes and I want to end somewhere else, is I then would go to school board meetings and I refer to all of us as the FOIA 38, like the Chicago 7, and I'd say, I'm sorry, FOIA 38, that we got involved in this, making it clear that this was a kind of net of surveillance McCarthy interrogation, that it wasn't about me, it was actually about fingering 4 of these black elected officials, and challenging the town not to collude in the fear and the silence. And I have to say, I've talked to a number of you who have been involved in university struggles, and it's the collusion around fear and silence that's the worst. And if we can break that, because fast forward, they got all my emails, they posted them up. There's now a website that has all my emails on it. And it's a little horrifying. What I really wanted was to protect the teachers and the parents. And I did get them to magic marker out those names. But typical CUNY probably buys like secondhand magic markers so you can see right through it. And then they made like a horrible video about and this is all anonymous. Here's my takeaway. My takeaway is really rich corporate folks work anonymously. In the South, they work behind sheets. In the North, they work behind money and computers and anonymity. And if they had come to a school board meeting for a fair fight about, we probably have different ideologies about education, it would have been different. But they're really losing. I have to say, like in our town, in Newark, in New York, there are swells of parents who are resisting high-stakes testing. We got 48% opt-out rate. New York City has gotten really high. So, and they don't have another strategy other than nasty. Sorry. So if you can like work through the fact that it's actually not that scary. Like there are, you know, I write to Mark and I say, I want to show the video. Of course, I don't have time. And Mark like generates a Canadian petition for me. And that kind of happened all over the world. Like people were so outraged that the privatization of K-12 around evidence and then the academic chilling and intimidation of higher ed comes together in this case. And so let me end with thoughts about higher ed. There's good reason for us all to be suspect and cynical about higher education, right? It's a colonial project, it's an enclosure. It has decided who can do knowledge and who can't, who has access and who doesn't. At the moment, I prefer to see higher ed as an assemblage, as a set of varied currents, corporate for sure, colonial for sure, transformative maybe, potentially radical, idealistic. I reread the Edward Said essay, Lost Causes, a lot. And he's got this beautiful essay where he says, you know, if we concede that it's a lost cause, it's over. And actually every revolution has resisted the pull, the existential pull toward the lost cause. And I think of the notion of survivance, of survival and resistance, an indigenous notion, as those of us who are in the academy, if we're going to stay there, We need to consider it an assemblage where there are these possibilities, and then fortunately we have administrators like David and your president and Linda who are working on the inside to create space. So I think we have 4 strategies, from the tiny to the large. I think we can disrupt from within. I get a lot of requests for forms that I don't fill out. Does anybody else do that? Like, just don't, you know, like, and are they coming to your house and taking your oldest child? You know, so, and then I think those of us who are tenured and senior should be resisting. We should be talking about multiple forms of evidence. We should be opening up the conversation. Don't resist the conversation about accountability. People probably have taxpayers have a right to know, at least at my place, what we are doing. And they should be looking at how much money is being spent on metric madness and administrators, to be honest. So we should be raising those questions about multiple indicators and accountability at the top. What we now have is accountability at the bottom and a pass card at the top. There is no accountability for administrators. There's no accountability for corporations. There's no accountability for the corporate reform education movement. Everybody knows high stakes testing hasn't worked, and yet they keep challenging the evidence that challenges them. All right, so we need to resist. The second is that we need to organize within our institutions across borders that we might not usually work across, but interdisciplinary. We've been working on both dreamers' access to higher ed, but also the ways in which formerly incarcerated people have been excluded from higher ed. And Muslim students are under surveillance, and how police are present in schools. And so we're creating kind of networks within that bring together the ed school, but with other movements on campus to understand there is a movement to reclaim the illusory notion of the public in public education. Public as a verb, as a place of struggle, as a not yet, as a utopian but deserved. And then fourth is that I think we really need solidarity across national borders. Again, just having come from South Africa, have spent a lot of time in Brazil, being here, I think there's utility in having various presidents of universities standing together to say, no, we're not doing it that way. Or we're doing it in a deeper, thicker, more interesting way. As you suggested, Dewey distinguished between aesthetic and anesthetic education. Aesthetic is the kind that provokes a wide awakeness. Anesthetic is the kind that numbs you and puts you to sleep, which is what metric madness does. And so I'm going to shut up. Thank you. Good.
For the discussion.
Good. Go ahead.
I just wanted to start by thanking you for that talk. That was really wonderful. I spent 4 years teaching in Baltimore City, and so a lot of that was quite familiar to me. But I don't know if this is a question so much as a comment, but I know that we often have this view of the United States as this you know, with failing schools and the segregation and all of that. But I think that there is a great danger in us as Canadians thinking that we are any better. There is just as much of a huge gap in terms of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit learners here. And that I think the myth of Canada as the land of equity is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, no, I have a colleague, Martin Ruck, who's from Nova Scotia. He's Black Canadian. And he said, boy, we Canadians really lucked out being next to the United States because it's easy to look good. I want to get to your point about the gaps. And I was talking to Linda earlier about this, and Laura and Eve, because you know, so much of the accountability equity stuff, the good parts of it started with a concern for those gaps. And what we have watched is an industry of gap gazing and then gotcha, right? So it's really easy to go to any school in the United States and compare low-income African American to high-income white kids, and we're going to have a gap. And we should be paying really interesting attention to detracking and class size and rethinking the curriculum and supporting educators and getting rid of people who are terrible. I have no problem with that. But instead, it becomes an industry of gotcha, fear, anxiety. People are scared. The good ones are leaving in a lot of those schools. Mediocre ones are becoming less good, and everybody learns just to teach to the test. And so the shrinkage of the curriculum is unbelievable. I was so interested yesterday to hear about reimagining curriculum and Lee's talk about learning, professional development in many of these schools is now looking at Excel spreadsheets saying, oh my God, poor Black, poor Latino, immigrant, special ed, compared to high-end what? Well, that story was written at the birth of our country, at the original genocide, at the original, we did that story. And now the question is, are there transformative possibilities? And another talk, another day, when you come to New York, it's about all the wonderful things going on in schools that have a little bit of freedom, where teachers are doing amazing work, thinking about gaps, not as gaps, but as communities of learners who are bringing different gifts, different struggles. Yes and yes, why don't you both say them and then I'll talk and then we're done? Is that good?
Okay, Dawn Basie from York University in Toronto, probably one of the only Faculty of Science and Engineering professors here. So my question to you is, I'd love to hear later on in a chat with you how you think different universities are handling the FOI requests, and I would challenge everyone in this room to do an FOI with the federal government if you have been speaking out against Harper, to find out what they're saying about you, because I've certainly got that in motion on me, because I was one of the only scientists at the American Association for Advancement of Science 2012 Symposium pointing out the muzzling of federal government scientists who was prepared to go on the record. They couldn't actually find anybody, and I'm a full professor who is tenured, so you're quite right. We're some of the few people who can actually, at this point, speak out with impunity. But I can tell you, I am being watched, including by my own administration.
Yeah. Well, what's cool about that, though, is that might be an action item that comes out of this conference that we all FOIA, because FOIA is a good law. It's our law, right? We shouldn't trust the law. It's our law. It's just being exploited by folks who want to privatize public universities or using a public law to undo public. So, and then we could have T-shirts that say botched bitches. That would be fun, right? It's another possibility. Go ahead, Len.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I think you've given us a stark contrast between exposure and explanation. Yeah. Exposure is a punitive practice. Explanation is at the heart of the educational enterprise. One could say that evidence is the outcome of engagement, and evidence is the invitation to further engagement. If we put it inside that frame, which the theme of the conference invites us to do, then that's not the end of the work, but the beginning of the work of the critical interrogation of the provenance, impetus, and objectives of evidence as a product of engagement, and then where do you transform that into the kind of progressive agenda that you so compellingly incarnate, if I can put it that way. So could you push this notion of where the evidence comes from, who claims legitimacy for it, and how it can be critically contested and turned into the tools of transformation?
Yeah, can I do 2 minutes on that and then we're done? So let me just, because I've already referenced this Moorish Justice Project in the Bronx, and this is mostly led by Maria Torre, Brett Stout. Jackie Robinson is one of those grandmothers who'd been and is now a researcher who presents at the American Psychological Association, a well-known torture organization, which is happening in Toronto next week. All of our contradictions are intense. All right, so they thought this was a 6-month program. They had a $25,000 grant. They paid the community people to be researchers. We always start every project off with a research camp where we share the different knowledges we bring, right? So some people really know about the patterns of the police. Some of us know how to read NYPD stats. We teach everybody critical statistics. So on Saturdays in bars, by Yankee Stadium, grandmothers who are probably younger than me would be with their glasses to fit, because people can do crosstabs on police violence. You know, it's like when you've got the experience in your body, the statistics come alive. Then they created the survey. And for us at the Public Science Project, critical issue is no policy should be developed for communities without communities having the primary commitment to and knowledge shaping that work. And most of the times we get away with that commitment, sometimes not. They want an evaluator of the lawsuit decision around stop and frisk. And it was very clear that researchers who partnered with the police department were seen as scientists, and researchers who partnered with community were seen as advocates. So it's, anyway, so they collected all this data. Everybody comes to either the Graduate Center or the Yankee Tavern on Saturdays. They're analyzing the data. One of the things they're doing a lot of is analyzing the marginalia on the surveys. And 60% of these surveys have like comments on the side. And we read that as people's generous desire to educate us about the ways in which we've asked the wrong question. Right? And it's really amazing. Like, and then there are items like, how many times were you stopped by the police this year? And they write, 100,000, 000. Or, have you ever been called names by the police? And they list unbelievable names that young people are growing up with the people who are supposed to protect them, physically, psychically, culturally, assaulting them. And when they need help, they got no one to go to, right? Anyway, so then we collected all the data. That then got fed into lawsuits. We came together with Muslim American young people whose families were not in the criminal courts, they're in the private detention centers, right? We came together with LGBT young people who have very high rates of police harassment. In the Bronx now, there are artists involved in doing murals based on the data. There are scholarly projects. So our two commitments are people who are most intimately affected by injustice shape the research questions. We come together and do a variety. The best is when everybody does everything, and then they own the data at the end. So there's an archive at the South Bronx Library that, because these are communities that have been studied and studied, and they don't, so they own it. And now there's community-based, as I am leaving, I will tell you, there's community-based conversations about the data on what would a safe community look like, because that's not an easy question. If it's not 1 million aggressive cops, what does it look like? Thank you, goodbye.